The black crepe dress rustled against the wooden platform as Margaret Hayes stepped down from the train in Rhyolite, Nevada. The summer heat of 1907 immediately wrapping around her like an unwelcome embrace, despite the mourning veil that shadowed her pale face. She clutched a worn leather valise in one gloved hand and pressed the other against her stomach, trying to calm the nervous flutter that had taken residence there since she had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago. The train station was little more than a covered platform with a small ticket office, dust swirling in lazy circles as the locomotive hissed and prepared for its departure. Margaret had expected someone to meet her, the man whose letters had been so kind, so full of promise about a new life in the Nevada desert. But the platform was nearly empty save for a few miners heading into town, and an older woman carrying a basket of what looked like fresh bread. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 8 months now. 8 months since the factory accident that had crushed him beneath falling machinery, leaving her alone in a city that had no use for a widow with no children and no means of support. The black dress she wore was the same one she had worn to his funeral, carefully mended and pressed for this journey. It was all she could afford, and propriety demanded she wear mourning clothes for at least a year. But the weight of the fabric felt like the weight of her grief, heavy and suffocating. She scanned the dusty street beyond the platform, looking for the face she had only seen in a single tintype photograph. Connor Irving. A cattle rancher, his letter had said, with a spread 10 miles outside of Rhyolite. He had been honest about his circumstances in his correspondence. He was 30 years old, a widower himself for the past 2 years, and he needed a wife to help run his household and perhaps, one day, to fill the empty spaces in his life with something other than work and silence. Margaret was 24, still young enough to hope for a future that did not involve scrubbing floors in boarding houses or worse. When she had seen the advertisement in the newspaper, something had stirred in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. A possibility. And so she had written to him, and he had written back. And after 3 months of letters that had grown increasingly warm and personal, he had sent money for her train fare and asked her to come west. But now, standing alone on the platform with the train pulling away behind her, Margaret wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. A voice called out from the street. "Mrs. Hayes." She turned to see a tall man striding toward her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. He wore dark trousers and a blue work shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but as he drew closer and removed it, Margaret saw dark hair slightly too long, gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and a face that was more weathered than the photograph had suggested, but not unkind. "I am Margaret Hayes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Irving." "Connor Irving, yes, madam." He stopped a respectful distance away, turning the hat in his hands. His gaze took in her mourning dress, and something shifted in his expression. Concern, perhaps, or understanding. "I apologize for not being right here when the train arrived. Had some trouble with a wagon wheel on the way into town. Welcome to Rhyolite." "Thank you." Margaret was not sure what else to say. The man before her was larger than she had imagined, broader through the shoulders, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. There was a stillness about him, a quiet watchfulness that made her uncertain. "I have a room for you at the boarding house for tonight," Connor said after a moment of silence. "Figured you would want to rest after the journey before heading out to the ranch. We can get the formalities taken care of tomorrow if that suits you." The formalities. He meant the wedding. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She had known this was coming, had agreed to it in her letters, but the reality of marrying a stranger felt suddenly overwhelming. Still, What choice did she have? She had spent nearly all of her savings on necessities for the journey. She could not afford a return ticket, even if she had anywhere to return to. That would be acceptable, she said quietly. Connor nodded and reached for her valise. Let me take that for you. The boarding house is just up the street. Mrs. Chen runs it. She is a good woman, and she will take care of you. Margaret released the valise and fell into step beside him as they walked away from the station. Rhyolite was smaller than she had imagined. A collection of wooden buildings and tents clustered along a main street that ran through the center of town. The air smelled of dust and creosote, with an underlying tang of minerals from the mines that dotted the surrounding hills. Men moved along the wooden sidewalks, most of them dressed in work clothes, their faces weathered by sun and wind. A few women were visible, but they were outnumbered 10-1 by the men. Town is still young, Connor said, as if reading her thoughts. Founded just 2 years ago when they discovered gold in the hills. Growing fast, though. We have got stores, saloons, a bank, even a schoolhouse now. It is not St. Louis, but it is becoming a proper town. It seems very different from what I am used to, Margaret admitted. I imagine it is. Connor glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something that might have been sympathy in his eyes. I know this is not easy, Mrs. Hayes, coming all this way to marry a man you have never met. I want you to know that I will do my best to be a good husband to you. I do not expect anything from you that you are not ready to give. We can take our time getting to know each other. The kindness in his words made Margaret's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She blinked them away quickly, grateful for the veil that hid her face. Thank you, Mr. Irving. That is very understanding of you. They reached the boarding house, a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and lace curtains in the windows. Connor held the door open for her, and they stepped into a cool, dim interior that smelled of baking bread and lemon oil. A small Chinese woman emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face lit up when she saw Connor. Mr. Irving, good afternoon. And this must be your bride. Mrs. Chen, this is Mrs. Margaret Hayes. She will be staying the night. I have already arranged for the room. Mrs. Chen came forward and took both of Margaret's hands in hers, peering up at her with warm, dark eyes. Welcome, welcome. You must be so tired from your journey. Come, I will show you to your room. I have hot water for a bath if you would like, and supper will be ready at 6. That sounds wonderful, Margaret said gratefully. Connor set her valise down by the stairs. I will come by tomorrow morning around 9 if that is all right. We can go to the courthouse then. Margaret nodded, suddenly unable to speak. This was really happening. Tomorrow she would marry this man, this stranger with kind eyes and a quiet manner, and her life would change forever. Connor must have seen something in her posture because he stepped closer and said softly, It is going to be all right, Mrs. Hayes. I know you have been through a lot, so have I. We will figure this out together. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Margaret was left standing in the boarding house with Mrs. Chen's gentle hand on her arm. Come now, the older woman said. Let me show you to your room. You need rest and food and a good night's sleep. Tomorrow is a new day. Margaret followed her up the stairs, each step feeling like she was climbing toward an unknown future. The room Mrs. Chen showed her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a white quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a window that looked out over the street. Mrs. Chen promised to bring up hot water and left Margaret alone. She removed her hat and veil and sank down onto the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she unpinned her hair. What had Thomas been like when she had first met him? They had been young, barely 20, and their courtship had been proper and brief. She had thought she loved him, and perhaps she had, in the way that young people love, full of romance and expectation. The reality of marriage had been different, harder, less magical than she had imagined. But they had been building a life together, and she had been content. Now Thomas was gone and she was here, about to marry another man, a man who had also lost someone. She wondered about Connor's first wife, what she had been like, how she had died. He had not mentioned it in his letters beyond acknowledging that he was a widower. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Chen and a young woman brought in a large tub and several buckets of steaming water. They filled the tub, left soap and towels, and departed with smiles and reassurances. Margaret locked the door and undressed, sinking into the hot water with a sigh of relief. Her muscles ached from days of travel, and the heat seemed to leach away some of her anxiety. She washed carefully, trying not to think too much about tomorrow. One step at a time. That was all she could do. That evening, she ate supper in the dining room with the other boarders, mostly single men who worked in the mines. They were polite but curious, their eyes lingering on her morning dress. Mrs. Chen served roasted chicken and vegetables, fresh bread and apple pie. It was the best meal Margaret had eaten in weeks, and she found herself relaxing slightly in the warm, noisy atmosphere of the boarding house. After supper, she returned to her room and sat by the window, watching the sun set over the desert hills. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, colors so vivid they seemed unreal. In St. Louis, the sky had always been hazy with smoke from the factories. Here, everything was sharp and clear, almost painfully bright. She thought about Connor Irving. He had been kind today, patient and understanding. That was more than some women got from their husbands. Perhaps this would not be so terrible. Perhaps they could build something together, a partnership if not a great romance. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams full of trains and dust and a tall man with gray eyes. Morning arrived too quickly. Margaret dressed carefully in her black dress, pinned her hair up, and adjusted her veil. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw a pale, serious woman staring back. Not a bride, a widow about to become a wife again. Connor arrived promptly at 9, dressed in clean clothes, his hair neatly combed. He offered his arm, and together they walked to the courthouse, a solid brick building at the end of the main street. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, performed by a justice of the peace who seemed more interested in getting back to his paperwork than in celebrating a wedding. Connor produced a simple gold band, and when he slipped it onto her finger, his hand was steady even though Margaret's trembled. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the justice said. "You may kiss the bride." Connor looked at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he leaned down to press a chaste kiss to her cheek, his lips barely grazing her skin through the veil. And just like that, it was done. She was Mrs. Connor Irving. They walked out into the bright sunlight, and Margaret felt dizzy for a moment. Connor steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I just need a moment." "We do not have to go to the ranch today if you are not feeling well. We can stay another night at the boarding house." Margaret shook her head. "No, I would rather go. I would rather see my new home." Connor nodded and led her to a wagon waiting nearby. It was sturdy and practical, pulled by 2 strong horses. He helped her up onto the seat and climbed up beside her. As they rolled out of Rhyolite, Margaret looked back at the small town, wondering when she would return. The ride to the ranch took nearly 2 hours. The road was rough, little more than a track through the desert, winding between scrubby bushes and rocky outcroppings. Connor pointed out landmarks along the way, a distinctive rock formation, a dry creek bed that ran with water in the spring, the boundary markers for his land. "I have got about 500 acres," he explained. It is not much compared to some of the spreads in Texas, but it is good grazing land. I run about 200 head of cattle, mostly Herefords. I've got 2 hired hands who help with the work. Good men. They live in the bunkhouse and take their meals in the main house. Margaret listened, trying to imagine what her life would be like here. She had never lived on a ranch before. She knew nothing about cattle or horses or any of the work that went into running such a place. As if sensing her thoughts, Connor said, "I do not expect you to work the cattle, but I would appreciate your help with the house, the cooking, the garden if you are inclined. My last housekeeper left 6 months ago to get married, and I have been managing on my own since then. It is not going well," he added with a rueful smile. "I can cook and keep house," Margaret said. "That much I know how to do. That is all I need." They crested a low rise, and the ranch came into view. It was larger than Margaret had expected, a sprawling single-story house built of adobe and wood, with a covered porch that ran along the front. Several outbuildings were visible: a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals with horses moving lazily in the heat. Trees had been planted near the house, cottonwoods that provided shade, and there was a vegetable garden, though it looked somewhat neglected. Connor pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Home," he said simply. He helped Margaret down and carried her valise to the porch. The front door opened into a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area. There was a stone fireplace, a long wooden table with benches, a stove, shelves lined with dishes and supplies. Doors led off to other rooms. Everything was clean but sparse, functional rather than decorative. "Your room is this way," Connor said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a bedroom with a large bed, a wardrobe, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the garden. "This was the guest room. I thought you would want your own space, at least for now." Margaret set down her valise and removed her hat and veil. She felt Connor's presence behind her and turned to face him. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Connor," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Where do you sleep?" "My room is across the hall." "I want you to know, Margaret, that I meant what I said yesterday. I do not expect anything from you that you are not ready to give. We are married, yes, but we are also strangers. I am hoping we can become friends first, and then we will see where that leads." The tightness in Margaret's chest eased slightly. "Thank you, I appreciate your patience." "I know you are still in mourning," Connor continued. "I respect that. When my wife Sarah died, it took me a long time to feel like myself again. Grief is not something you can rush. How did she die?" The question slipped out before Margaret could stop it. "I am sorry, that was forward of me." "No, it is all right. You have a right to know." Connor leaned against the door frame, his expression distant. "She died in childbirth. The baby too, a son. 2 years ago this spring." Margaret's hand went to her throat. "I am so sorry. We had been married 5 years. We were so happy when we found out she was expecting, but something went wrong during the delivery. The doctor could not stop the bleeding." His voice was flat, carefully controlled. "I buried them together, up on the hill behind the house. That must have been unbearable." "It was. But life goes on, does not it? The ranch does not stop needing work just because your heart is broken, so I kept working. And eventually the pain became bearable, not gone but bearable." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 people bound by shared loss. "My husband died in a factory accident," Margaret said quietly. "One moment he was alive and the next he was gone. I did not even get to say goodbye. The foreman came to our apartment and told me there had been an accident, and that was it. Thomas was just gone." Connor nodded slowly. "It is a hard thing to lose someone like that, sudden, no warning." "Yes." Margaret found herself blinking back tears. She had not cried in weeks, had thought she had no more tears left, but something about Connor's understanding made her want to weep. "Well," Connor said, straightening, "I will let you get settled. The privy is out back and there is a pump in the kitchen for water. I will be working near the barn this afternoon if you need anything. Please make yourself at home. This is your house now, too." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Margaret sat down on the bed and let out a long breath. She was married again. This was her home now. This man was her husband. It all felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. She unpacked her valise, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her personal items on the dresser. It did not take long. She had so little. When she was done, she wandered back out to the main room and stood looking around, trying to see it as her space, her domain. The kitchen was well stocked but disorganized. She could see evidence of Connor's bachelor housekeeping, dishes washed but not put away properly, supplies scattered across the shelves without any clear system. The garden visible through the window needed weeding. The floor could use a good scrubbing. Margaret found herself rolling up her sleeves. This, at least, was something she could control. She could bring order to this house. She could make it a home. She spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing, working steadily through the heat of the day. She found flour and yeast and started bread dough rising. She scrubbed the floor, reorganized the shelves, washed windows. The physical work felt good, purposeful. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, she heard voices outside. Connor was talking to two other men. Margaret went to the door and saw them standing by the barn, three figures in the golden light. Connor gestured toward the house and the other two men nodded. A few minutes later, Connor came in with the two men following. "Margaret, these are my hired hands. This is Jim Dawson and Roberto Sanchez. Gentlemen, this is my wife, Mrs. Irving." The two men removed their hats. Jim was younger, perhaps 25, with sandy hair and a sunburned face. Roberto was older, maybe 40, with dark eyes and a quiet dignity. "Pleased to meet you, madam," Jim said with a wide smile. "It is good to have a lady on the ranch again." "Welcome, Senora Irving," Roberto added with a small bow. "Thank you both," Margaret said. "I hope to have supper ready soon. Will you be joining us?" "Yes, madam, if that is all right," Jim said. "We usually eat with the boss." "Of course." The men went to wash up, and Margaret returned to the kitchen, her heart beating a little faster. This was her first meal as mistress of this house. She wanted it to be good. She worked quickly, making biscuits to go with the stew she had found simmering on the back of the stove. The bread she had started earlier was ready to be shaped and baked. She moved through the kitchen with increasing confidence, and by the time the men returned, the table was set and the food was ready. They ate together, the four of them around the long table. The men were clearly hungry and they complimented her cooking with genuine enthusiasm. Margaret felt a small glow of pride. This, at least, she could do well. After supper, Jim and Roberto returned to the bunkhouse, and Margaret was left alone with Connor. She washed the dishes while he dried, and they worked in companionable silence. When the kitchen was clean, Connor poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table. "You did not have to clean the whole house," he said, looking around at the transformed space. "I wanted to. It gave me something to do. Well, it looks wonderful, better than it has looked in months." He sipped his coffee. "You are a good cook, too. Those were the best biscuits I have had in a long time." "Thank you." They sat quietly for a while, the evening air cooling, the light fading outside the windows. Margaret found herself relaxing slightly. This was not so terrible. Connor was kind, the ranch was beautiful in its stark way, and she had a purpose here. Perhaps she could be content. "Tell me about St. Louis," Connor said. "What was your life like there?" So Margaret told him, haltingly at first and then with increasing ease. She told him about growing up in the city, about her father who had been a clerk and her mother who had died when Margaret was 12. She told him about meeting Thomas, about their brief courtship and their marriage. She told him about the small apartment they had shared, about Thomas's work in the factory, about their dreams of saving enough money to buy a little house with a yard. And then she told him about the day Thomas died, about the shock and the grief, about struggling to make ends meet on her own, about the loneliness and the fear that had driven her to answer Connor's advertisement. Connor listened without interrupting, his gray eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I know it could not have been easy." "It actually felt good to talk about it," Margaret admitted. "I have not really talked to anyone about Thomas since he died. People in the city did not want to hear about it. They had their own troubles." "It is different out here," Connor said. "We look after each other. It is too hard to survive otherwise." "Tell me about your life," Margaret said. "Before Sarah died, what was it like?" So Connor talked, his voice low and measured. He told her about growing up in Kansas, about his father who had been a rancher and his mother who had been the daughter of a shopkeeper. He told her about learning to ride and rope, about the hard work of ranching, about coming to Nevada 5 years ago to start his own spread. He told her about meeting Sarah at a church social in Rhyolite, about courting her for 6 months before they married, about the happiness they had shared. And then he told her about the day Sarah died, about his helplessness as she faded away, about the emptiness that had filled his life afterward. His voice remained steady, but Margaret could see the pain in his eyes, the grief that still lived just beneath the surface. "I am sorry you went through that," she said softly. "I am sorry you lost Thomas," Connor replied. They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Understanding, recognition of shared pain. Eventually Connor stood. "I should let you rest. It has been a long day." Margaret rose as well. They stood awkwardly for a moment, and then Connor said, "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Connor." She retreated to her room and changed into her nightgown, her movements slow with exhaustion. When she climbed into bed, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Horses moving in the corrals, the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. The creak of the house settling. She thought about the day, about becoming a wife again, about the man sleeping across the hall. Connor Irving was not what she had expected. He was quieter, more thoughtful, more damaged. But he was kind and he was honest, and he understood loss in a way few people did. Perhaps that would be enough. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Margaret woke early before the sun and started breakfast for the men. She cooked and cleaned and began tending the neglected garden. Connor and the hired hands worked with the cattle, riding out early and returning in the evening dusty and tired. They ate their meals together, the conversation gradually becoming easier and more natural. Margaret learned about ranching through their dinner conversations. She learned about rotating pastures and breeding stock, about predators and weather and markets. Connor was patient with her questions, never making her feel ignorant. Jim was full of stories and jokes, keeping the table lively. Roberto spoke less but with quiet wisdom, often sharing insights about the land and the animals. Slowly, Margaret began to feel less like a stranger in this place. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the sounds and smells and textures. She learned which chickens were the best layers, which horse was which in the corrals, where the best herbs grew wild near the creek bed. And slowly, carefully, she and Connor began to know each other. They talked in the evenings after the others had gone to the bunkhouse. They talked about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Connor told her about his plans for the ranch, about wanting to improve his herd, about maybe buying more land. Margaret told him about her love of reading, about how she had always dreamed of having a real library full of books. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Connor presented her with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I went into town today," he said. "I got you something." Margaret unwrapped the package carefully and found 3 books inside. Her breath caught. They were novels, beautiful bound editions, the kind she had always coveted but never been able to afford. "Connor, these are too much," she protested. "No, they are not. You said you liked to read. I want you to have things that make you happy." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes stinging with tears. "Thank you. This is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a long time." Something shifted in Connor's expression, a softening. "You deserve kindness, Margaret." That night, reading in her room by lamplight, Margaret realized that something had changed in her heart. She was no longer just going through the motions of being Connor's wife. She was beginning to care for him, to look forward to their evening conversations, to notice the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness in his rough hands. It frightened her. She had not expected to feel anything for Connor beyond gratitude and perhaps friendship. But this was something more. Something that made her pulse quicken when he was near, that made her hyper-aware of his presence in the house. She was not sure she was ready for this. She was still in mourning. She still wore her black dress every day, still felt the weight of Thomas's death. But the human heart, she was discovering, did not always follow the rules of propriety. Summer deepened into the scorching heat of August. The ranch work continued relentlessly. Margaret threw herself into her own work, tending the garden, preserving vegetables for winter, sewing and mending clothes. She was building a life here, she realized. This was becoming home. One evening, Connor came in from work later than usual, his face grim. Margaret looked up from where she was preparing dinner. "What is wrong?" "One of the steers is sick. Looks like it might be spreading to others. I am going to have to quarantine them, maybe call the veterinarian from town." "Is it serious?" "Could be. If it spreads through the whole herd, it could wipe me out financially." Connor slumped into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "I cannot afford to lose the herd, Margaret. This ranch is everything I have." Margaret came over and, without thinking, put her hand on his shoulder. "We will figure it out. You are a good rancher, you will handle it." Connor looked up at her, and something in his eyes made her heart skip. He covered her hand with his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Thank you. It helps having you here, knowing I am not alone in this." The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Then Connor squeezed her hand and released it, and Margaret stepped back, her cheeks flushing. Over the next week, Connor worked nearly around the clock trying to contain the illness in the herd. Margaret helped however she could, bringing meals out to him, staying up late to keep him company while he watched the sick animals. The veterinarian came and went, prescribing treatments that were expensive and not guaranteed to work. Margaret watched Connor drive himself to exhaustion and felt her heart ache for him. She wanted to ease his burden somehow, to take some of the worry from his shoulders. But all she could do was be there, present and steady, offering whatever support he would accept. Finally, after days of tension, the sick animals began to recover. The illness had been contained. Connor had saved his herd. The night they knew for certain that the crisis had passed, Connor came in from the barn and simply stood in the kitchen, swaying slightly on his feet. Margaret took one look at him and guided him to a chair. "You need to rest. You are going to collapse." "I am all right." "No, you are not. You have barely slept in a week. Sit down." Connor sat, and Margaret brought him food and coffee. He ate mechanically, his movements slow with exhaustion. When he finished, Margaret said, "Come on, you are going to bed." She walked him to his room, and he sank onto the bed fully clothed. Margaret knelt and pulled off his boots, then covered him with a blanket. Connor's eyes were already closing. "Margaret," he murmured. "Yes, thank you. For being here, for helping." "Of course. We are partners in this, are we not?" "Partners," he repeated, and then he was asleep. Margaret stood looking down at him for a long moment. His face was relaxed in sleep, younger-looking, vulnerable. She had an overwhelming urge to smooth the hair back from his forehead, to kiss him. Instead, she turned and left the room quietly. But she knew, standing alone in the darkened hallway, that she was falling in love with her husband. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had not thought she would ever feel this way again. Had not thought she wanted to. September arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and relief from the summer heat. The garden produced abundantly, and Margaret spent days canning and preserving. Connor's herd was healthy again, and there was talk of a good price for beef at the market. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Margaret had been at the ranch for nearly 3 months now. 3 months of living alongside Connor, learning his habits and moods, sharing meals and conversation. 3 months of slowly building something together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Connor said, "You have done wonders with the garden. I have not seen it look this good in years. I enjoy working in it. There is something satisfying about growing things. You have made this whole place feel like a home again," Connor continued. "I did not realize how much I missed that until you came." Margaret looked over at him. In the golden light of sunset, his profile was strong and handsome. "I am glad I came," she said quietly. "I was so frightened when I got off that train, but this has been good. You have been good to me." Connor turned to meet her eyes. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "I know we agreed to take things slow, to become friends first, and I think we have done that. You are my friend, Margaret, but you are also more than that." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I have feelings for you, real feelings. I did not expect it to happen, but it has, and I wanted you to know." Margaret's breath caught. "Connor, You do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know you are still in mourning. I know I am probably rushing things, but I wanted to be honest with you. I care about you. A great deal." "I care about you too," Margaret said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I think I have been falling in love with you, and I did not know how to tell you. I felt guilty, like I was betraying Thomas somehow, but the truth is I am happy here. With you. And that feeling is only growing stronger." Connor reached over and took her hand. His grip was firm and warm. "You are not betraying anyone by being happy, Margaret. Your husband would want you to have a good life, and I promise you, I will do everything in my power to give you that." "I know you will." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You are a good man, Connor Irving." They sat in silence, hands clasped, as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to emerge. Margaret felt something settle in her chest, a rightness that had been missing for so long. She was where she was supposed to be, with the person she was supposed to be with. "May I kiss you?" Connor asked, his voice low. "Yes." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Margaret did not want to pull away. She wanted him. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Not a passionate embrace, but something deeper. A beginning. When they pulled apart, Connor rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks." Margaret laughed softly. "So have I." They sat together on the porch until the night grew cold, talking and holding hands. When they finally went inside, Connor walked Margaret to her bedroom door. "Good night," he said, kissing her hand. "Good night, Connor." But as Margaret lay in bed that night, she wondered how much longer she would be sleeping alone. The idea of sharing a bed with Connor, of truly being his wife in every way, no longer frightened her. In fact, she found herself looking forward to it. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She went to her wardrobe and took out her black mourning dress, holding it for a long moment. She had worn it every day for nearly a year. It had been her armor, her announcement to the world that she was not available, that she was still wrapped in grief. But she did not want to be wrapped in grief anymore. She wanted to live. She wanted to love Connor without the shadow of the past hanging over her. She folded the black dress carefully and placed it in the bottom of the wardrobe. Then she pulled out one of the other dresses she owned, a simple brown calico that she had not worn in months. It was not fancy, but it was not mourning clothes either. When she walked into the kitchen for breakfast, Connor looked up and went still. His eyes took in her dress, her face free of the veil for the first time. "You look beautiful," he said. Margaret felt herself blush. "I decided it was time. Thomas has been gone nearly a year now. I think I have honored his memory enough. It is time to move forward." Connor stood and crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel rushed, I am sure. I want to be your wife, Connor, truly, not just in name." Understanding dawned in his eyes and something heated in his gaze. "Margaret." "Not yet," she said quickly. "I am not quite ready for that yet, but soon. I just wanted you to know where my heart is." Connor pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. Margaret rested her head against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady. This was right. This was where she belonged. "Take all the time you need," Connor murmured into her hair. "I will be here whenever you are ready." The days that followed were sweet and tender. Connor courted her properly, as if they were not already married. He brought her wildflowers from the range. He took her riding, teaching her to sit a horse properly and showing her the far corners of his property. He told her stories and made her laugh. He kissed her good night at her bedroom door, and Margaret fell more deeply in love with him every day. One afternoon, Connor took her to the hill behind the house where he had buried Sarah and his son. 2 simple wooden crosses marked the graves. Connor stood looking at them for a long moment, his hand tight in Margaret's. "I loved her," he said quietly, "and I grieved for her. But loving you does not diminish that. I am beginning to understand that the heart has room for more than one love, more than one chapter." "She would want you to be happy," Margaret said. "Yes, she would." Connor turned to her. "Just as your husband would want you to be happy." Margaret nodded, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of letting go, of stepping fully into this new life. Connor wiped her tears away gently. "You will never mourn alone again," he said. "I promise you that. Whatever sorrows come, whatever joys, we will face them together." "Together," Margaret echoed. He kissed her then, soft and deep, and Margaret felt something in her chest expand like a door opening onto a sunlit room. She was ready. Ready to let go of the past, ready to embrace the future. Ready to be Connor's wife in every way. That night when Connor walked her to her bedroom door, Margaret did not let go of his hand. "Stay," she said simply. Connor's eyes searched hers. "Are you certain?" "I am certain. I love you, Connor, and I want to be with you." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a passion that had been carefully leashed until now. Margaret kissed him back, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing close to his. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Connor opened her bedroom door and drew her inside, closing it behind them. And there, in the quiet of the night, Margaret became his wife fully and completely. It was tender and sweet and awkward in the way of new lovers, but it was also beautiful. They learned each other slowly, patiently, with care and growing confidence. Afterward, lying in Connor's arms, Margaret felt a peace she had not known in a long time. This was right. This was home. This was love. "I love you," Connor whispered against her hair. "I think I have loved you almost from the moment you stepped off that train in your widow's clothes, so brave and so scared." "I love you too," Margaret said. You have given me a life I never thought I would have. You have given me hope." They fell asleep tangled together, and when morning came, Connor was still there. From that night on, they shared a bed and a life, truly married in every sense. The weeks that followed were perhaps the happiest of Margaret's life. She and Connor were inseparable, stealing kisses in the kitchen, holding hands on the porch, laughing together over meals. The hired hands noticed the change and smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Jim did mention once that it was good to see the boss happy again, and Roberto simply nodded in his quiet way, his eyes kind. Autumn arrived in a blaze of gold and red. The cattle were driven to market, fetching a good price. Connor used some of the profits to buy Margaret gifts, a new dress, a set of fine china, more books. She protested that he was spending too much, but he insisted. He wanted to give her everything. In return, Margaret made the ranch house into a real home. She sewed curtains for the windows, planted bulbs for spring flowers, filled shelves with jars of preserves. She cooked elaborate meals and packed special lunches for Connor to take with him when he rode out. She cared for him with a tenderness that came from deep love. One October morning, Margaret woke feeling queasy. She barely made it to the wash basin before she was sick. Connor hovered anxiously, holding her hair back. "Maybe you ate something bad," he said, but Margaret knew better. She had suspected for a week now, had noticed the changes in her body. She turned to look at Connor, her eyes wide. "I think I might be with child." Connor went very still. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but the signs are there." He pulled her close, his arms tight around her. "A baby," he whispered. "Margaret, are you happy about this?" "I am terrified," she admitted. "But yes, I am happy. Are you?" "I am more than happy. I am over the moon." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. "But I am also scared after what happened with Sarah." "I know, but we cannot live in fear. Whatever happens, we will face it together." "Remember, together," Connor agreed. As the weeks passed and Margaret's pregnancy became undeniable, Connor became almost comically protective. He would not let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest frequently, worried if she looked the slightest bit tired. Margaret found it both endearing and exasperating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one day when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I know. But I cannot lose you, Margaret. I just cannot." She saw the fear in his eyes, the memory of another pregnancy, another wife. She took his face in her hands. "You will not lose me. I am strong and I am healthy. This baby is going to be fine, and so am I." Connor kissed her palms. "I am going to hold you to that." Winter came, cold and harsh. Snow fell in the mountains, though the valley where the ranch sat received less. The cattle were brought closer to the house for easier care. Connor, Jim, and Roberto worked long hours keeping the animals fed and healthy. Inside, Margaret nested. She sewed baby clothes from soft cotton, knitted tiny blankets, prepared a cradle that had been Connor's when he was a baby. She read books about childbirth and infant care, trying to prepare herself for what was coming. Connor brought the doctor from Rhyolite to examine her. Dr. Harrison was an older man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He pronounced her healthy and the baby strong. "Delivery should be sometime in early spring," he said. "Around March, I would guess. Send for me when her time comes." March seemed both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. Margaret had never been through childbirth before. She had heard stories, of course, both encouraging and horrifying. She tried not to dwell on the fear, but sometimes at night it crept in, making her breath come fast. Connor always seemed to know when she was afraid. He would pull her close and talk to her about the future, about their child growing up on the ranch, learning to ride and rope, going to school in Rhyolite. He painted pictures with his words of a life full of love and laughter, and Margaret would relax, letting his vision soothe her. Christmas came and they celebrated quietly at the ranch. Margaret cooked a feast and Jim and Roberto joined them. They exchanged small gifts and sang carols, and for a few hours, the house was full of joy and warmth. Connor's gift to Margaret was a locket on a gold chain. Inside were two tiny photographs, one of Thomas and one of Sarah. "I know they are gone," Connor said as Margaret stared at the locket with tears streaming down her face. "But they were part of our lives. They shaped us into the people we are. I thought you might want to carry them with you." "It is perfect," Margaret whispered. "Thank you." She fastened the locket around her neck, and it rested there against her heart, a reminder of the past but also of how far she had come. The new year of 1908 arrived with a fierce snowstorm that trapped them all indoors for 3 days. Margaret read aloud from her books while the men played cards and told stories. When the storm finally broke, they emerged into a world transformed, everything covered in a blanket of white. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Margaret grew larger and more uncomfortable. Her back ached constantly. She could not find a comfortable position to sleep. The baby was active, kicking and rolling, making its presence known. Connor was attentive and patient, rubbing her back, helping her with tasks that had become difficult, never complaining when she woke him in the night because she could not sleep. "You are going to be a wonderful father," Margaret told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "I hope so." "I am certainly going to try. You will be, I know it." In early March, Margaret woke in the middle of the night with a strange, cramping sensation. She lay still for a moment, wondering if it was false labor. But then another cramp came, stronger this time, and she knew. "Connor," she said, shaking his shoulder. "Connor, wake up." He was instantly alert. "What is wrong?" "The baby is coming." Connor went pale in the lamplight. "Now, are you sure?" "I am sure." He was up and moving, pulling on clothes, his hands shaking slightly. "I will ride to town for the doctor. Jim and Roberto can stay with you." "All right, but hurry." Connor kissed her hard and fast. "I will be back before you know it. You are going to be fine. I love you. I love you too. Now go." He was gone in a rush of cold air and pounding hoofbeats. Margaret took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. She had read the books. She knew what to expect. But theory and reality were very different things. Jim and Roberto came to the house, roused by the noise. Roberto's wife had had 5 children, and he was surprisingly knowledgeable about the process. He boiled water and gathered clean cloths while Jim hovered anxiously, clearly out of his depth. The contractions grew stronger and closer together. Margaret paced the house, leaning against furniture when the pain grew too intense. She thought about Connor, prayed he would get back in time. She thought about the baby, about meeting her child. She thought about Thomas, about Sarah, about all the women who had gone through this before her. Dawn was breaking when Connor returned with Dr. Harrison. The doctor took one look at Margaret and ushered everyone out of the bedroom except for Connor. "She might want you here," he said, "but you need to stay calm and do as I say." Connor nodded, his face tight with worry. He took Margaret's hand, and she gripped it hard as another contraction washed over her. The labor was long and difficult. Hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Margaret cried and cursed and gritted her teeth. Connor stayed by her side the entire time, whispering encouragement, wiping her face with cool cloths, never letting go of her hand. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Dr. Harrison said, "All right, Mrs. Irving, it is time to push." Margaret bore down with everything she had, her entire body straining. Connor braced her, his voice steady in her ear. "You can do this. You are strong, just a little more." And then, suddenly, there was a baby's cry, sharp and angry and beautiful. Margaret collapsed back against the pillows, gasping. "It is a boy," Dr. Harrison announced, holding up a squirming, red-faced infant. A fine, healthy boy. Connor stared at his son with an expression of wonder and joy and terror. When the doctor placed the baby in Margaret's arms, Connor sank down beside them, his hand gently touching the baby's tiny head. "He is perfect," Connor whispered. "You did it, Margaret. You gave us a son." Margaret looked down at the tiny face, at the dark fuzz of hair and the scrunched features, and felt her heart expand impossibly. This was her child. Their child. A new life born of love and hope. "What should we name him?" she asked. Connor thought for a moment. "What about Thomas?" "After your late husband," Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "That would be perfect. Thomas Connor Irving." "Thomas," Connor repeated, trying out the name. "Welcome to the world, son." The baby blinked up at them, his tiny fist curling around Connor's finger, and Margaret felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. Dr. Harrison stayed for a few hours to make sure both mother and baby were doing well. Jim and Roberto came in to meet the new addition to the ranch, their faces split with wide grins. Roberto presented a tiny pair of leather booties he had made, and Jim promised to teach young Thomas to ride as soon as he was old enough. As night fell and the house grew quiet, Connor and Margaret lay in bed with their son between them. The baby was sleeping, his tiny breaths soft and even. "I was so scared," Connor admitted. "The whole time I kept thinking about Sarah, about how I lost her. I was terrified the same thing would happen to you." "But it did not," Margaret said firmly. "I am here, the baby is here, we are all fine." "You are incredible," Connor said. "You are the strongest person I know. I had you with me, that made all the difference." They lay in the darkness, listening to their son breathe, marveling at the miracle of him. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, about stepping off the train in Rhyolite in her widow's clothes, about the grief and fear she had carried. And she thought about Connor's words to her that first time on the hill, overlooking his wife's grave. "You will never mourn alone again." It had been a promise, and he had kept it. He had stood beside her through her grief, had helped her heal, had given her a new life filled with love and purpose. And now they had created new life together. "I love you," Margaret whispered. "I love you too," Connor replied. "Both of you, my family." Spring unfolded across the ranch in a riot of color and new life. The garden burst into bloom, the cattle produced calves, and young Thomas grew and thrived. He was a good baby, cheerful and alert, with Connor's gray eyes and Margaret's dark hair. Connor was besotted with his son. He carried the baby everywhere, showing him the horses and the cattle, talking to him about the ranch as if Thomas could understand every word. Margaret watched them together and felt her heart swell with joy. She had never imagined she could be this happy. After Thomas's death, she had thought that part of her life was over, that she would never again know real contentment, but Connor had proved her wrong. He had shown her that the heart could love again, could heal and grow and make room for new joy. As Thomas grew, the ranch prospered. Connor's careful management and hard work paid off. He was able to buy more land, increase his herd, and hire another hand. The house was expanded, with a proper bedroom for Thomas and a parlor for receiving visitors. Margaret's days were full but happy. She cared for Thomas, managed the household, and worked in her beloved garden. She also became involved in the growing community of Rhyolite, joining the ladies' auxiliary at the church and helping to organize social events. People commented on how happy the Irvings seemed, how devoted they were to each other and to their son. Some of the older women remembered when Connor had been a grieving widower, and they marveled at the transformation love had wrought. On Thomas's first birthday, they had a celebration at the ranch. Friends from town came, bringing gifts and good wishes. There was food and laughter and music. Jim played the fiddle, and couples danced in the yard as the sun set. Margaret stood on the porch holding Thomas, watching Connor dance with Mrs. Chen. He caught her eye and winked, and she laughed. Later, when their guests had gone and Thomas was asleep, they sat together on the porch as they had so many times before. "You remember the first time we sat here?" Connor asked. "The night we told each other how we felt." "Of course I remember. That was the night everything changed. I knew then that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you." Connor took her hand. "I still feel that way, more so now than ever." "I feel the same," Margaret said. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it again. You gave me a family." "We gave each other those things," Connor corrected. "You saved me too, Margaret. I was just existing before you came. You taught me how to live again." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, as the stars emerged overhead. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the horses answered with soft whinnies. These were the sounds of home, of life on the ranch, of the world they had built together. Years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ways of the ranch. Margaret and Connor welcomed 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah Rose, and another son they called James. The house was full of noise and laughter and love. Connor expanded the ranch until it was one of the most successful in the region. He became known as a fair and honest dealer, and other ranchers sought his advice. Margaret established a small school on the ranch for Thomas and the other children in the area, teaching them reading and arithmetic. Through it all, their love for each other deepened and matured. They were partners in every sense, sharing the work and the joys, supporting each other through difficult times, celebrating successes together. They had built something lasting, something real. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Connor took Margaret back to Rhyolite, to the train station where they had first met. They stood on the platform, and Connor took her hands. "10 years ago, you stepped off that train in your mourning clothes," he said. "You were the bravest person I had ever met, even though you were terrified. You took a chance on me, on this life, and you changed everything." "You changed everything for me too," Margaret replied. "You gave me a reason to stop mourning and start living. You kept your promise, Connor. I have never had to mourn alone. And you never will." Connor pulled her close. "I love you more today than I did 10 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is my promise to you, for as long as we both shall live." Margaret kissed him there on the platform, not caring who saw. This man, this life, this love, it was everything she had never known to ask for and everything she needed. As they rode back to the ranch in the wagon, the sun setting ahead of them, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about loss and grief, about taking chances and new beginnings. She thought about the woman she had been, arriving in widow's clothes with nothing but hope and desperation. And she thought about the woman she had become, strong and confident and deeply loved. When they arrived home, their children ran out to greet them, Thomas scooping up little Sarah while James toddled after them. Connor lifted James into his arms, and they all went inside together, a family, whole and happy. That night, lying in bed with Connor's arms around her, Margaret whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Connor murmured, half asleep. "For everything. For loving me. For giving me this life. For being exactly who you are." Connor tightened his arms around her. "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy with a broken heart. Thank you for healing it." They fell asleep wrapped together, and outside the window, the desert stars shone bright and clear, witnesses to a love that had grown from grief and loss into something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and constants in equal measure. The children grew tall and capable. Thomas became his father's right hand on the ranch, showing an aptitude for the work that made Connor's chest swell with pride. Sarah proved to have her mother's love of learning and her father's determination, a combination that made her formidable. Young James was the family diplomat, charming and kind, able to smooth over any conflict with his ready smile. Margaret and Connor aged gracefully together, their hair graying, lines deepening around their eyes, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, tempered by shared experience and tested by time. Connor often thought about the day Margaret had arrived in Rhyolite, and how close he had come to never placing that advertisement for a mail-order bride. He had hesitated for weeks, feeling guilty about seeking a new wife when Sarah had been gone such a short time. But loneliness and practical necessity had driven him to take the chance, and what a blessed chance it had been. Margaret had brought light back into his life, had filled the empty spaces with warmth and love and purpose. She had given him children and partnership, and a reason to look forward to each new day. Margaret, for her part, often reflected on how different her life might have been if she had not seen Connor's advertisement, if she had not gathered the courage to write to him. She might have ended up in a factory, working herself to exhaustion for pennies. She might have remarried out of desperation to someone unkind. She might have slowly faded away, worn down by poverty and grief. Instead, she had found love and home and a life richer than anything she had imagined. When Thomas was 21, he announced his intention to marry a girl from Rhyolite, the daughter of the banker. Margaret helped plan the wedding, and on the day itself, she stood beside Connor watching their son pledge his life to another, and she felt the circle completing. Her son would have what she and Connor had, a true partnership built on love and respect. Sarah followed a few years later, marrying a teacher who had come west from Boston. And James, true to his nature, fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, uniting two properties and two families in a bond that promised prosperity for generations. As grandchildren began to arrive, Margaret and Connor stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, though they remained active and engaged. They spent their days tending the garden together, reading on the porch, taking slow rides across the land that had been their home for so long. One summer evening, when Margaret was 60 and Connor was 66, they sat on their porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The house behind them was full of family, their children and grandchildren gathered for Sunday dinner. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the open windows. Connor reached for Margaret's hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that had begun to plague his joints. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About how lucky I am, how lucky we are." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were as warm as they had been the first time he told her he loved her. "I got a second chance at love, Margaret. Not everyone gets that. And not only did I find love again, I found the deepest, truest love of my life." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes. "You are going to make me cry, and we have a house full of people who will wonder what is wrong." "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. That is what I wanted to say. After all these years, after everything we have been through together, I just wanted you to know that loving you has been the greatest joy and privilege of my life." "Oh, Connor." Margaret leaned over and kissed him softly. "Loving you has been my salvation. You took a grieving widow off a train and showed her how to live again. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You kept your promise to me all those years ago. I never had to mourn alone. Every sorrow we faced together. And every joy was sweeter because I shared it with you." They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped, hearts full. Inside the house, someone called their names. It was time for dinner. Time to gather around the table with their family, to share food and stories and love. Connor stood and helped Margaret to her feet. They walked inside together, still hand in hand after all these years, and took their places at the head of the table. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, faces bright with love and happiness. Connor bowed his head to say grace, and his prayer was simple and heartfelt. He thanked God for the food, for the family gathered there, and most especially for the woman sitting beside him, the love of his life, his partner in all things. When the prayer ended, Margaret squeezed his hand. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. Everything that mattered was there in that look. A lifetime of love and devotion, of shared joys and sorrows, of promises kept and faith rewarded. As the meal began and conversation swirled around them, Margaret thought back one last time to that dusty train platform in Rhyolite, to the terrified young widow in mourning clothes who had taken a leap of faith into the unknown. She thought about Connor's first words to her, his kindness and patience, his understanding of grief and loss. And she thought about all the years since, each one a gift, each day another stitch in the beautiful tapestry of their shared life. She had arrived in widow's clothes, wrapped in grief and fear. But Connor had seen past the mourning dress to the woman beneath, had recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss but was still brave enough to hope for more. Together they had built something lasting. Together they had healed old wounds and created new joys. Together they had proved that love could bloom again, even in the hardest soil, even after the deepest loss. Margaret looked around the table at her family, at the legacy she and Connor had created together, and felt a profound sense of gratitude and peace. This was what love looked like. Not just the passionate beginning, but the steady, enduring partnership that weathered all storms and celebrated all victories. This was the life she had found when she stepped off that train in Rhyolite so many years ago. This was the life Connor had given her when he promised she would never mourn alone again. And it was more, so much more, than she had ever dared to dream. The evening stretched on, full of food and laughter and the comfortable chaos of a large family gathering. When at last the grandchildren had been tucked into various beds and the adult children had departed for their own homes, Margaret and Connor found themselves alone again on the porch, the place where so much of their love story had unfolded. The night was cool and clear, the sky a vast expanse of stars. Connor wrapped a blanket around Margaret's shoulders and pulled her close against his side. "Another good day," he said. "The best kind of day," Margaret agreed. "Surrounded by family, by love. I hope we have many more of them." "We will." Margaret turned to kiss his cheek. "We will have as many as God grants us, and we will treasure every one." They sat together in the darkness, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life of meaning and purpose from the ashes of their grief. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth and home. And in that moment, under the vast Nevada sky, Margaret Hayes Irving knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the man she was meant to love, living the life she was meant to live. She had come west in widow's clothes, but she had found so much more than she had sought. She had found love, true and lasting. She had found home. She had found herself. And she had found Connor, the cowboy who had promised she would never mourn alone again, and who had spent every day of their marriage keeping that promise. It was, Margaret thought as she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, the very best kind of love story. Not one without pain or challenge, but one where love conquered all, where two broken people had made each other whole, where promises were kept and faith was rewarded. Their story, born on a dusty train platform in Rhyolite, Nevada, in the summer of 1907, had unfolded into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the endless possibilities that await those brave enough to step into the unknown. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the desert night embraced them, Margaret and Connor Irving rested together, content in the knowledge that their love would endure for all the days of their lives and beyond, a legacy of hope and devotion for generations to come.